Sure. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Michelle Braun, who I have the privilege of running our frontotemporal degeneration caregiver support group with every month for the Alzheimer's Association. So Dr. Braun is the author of the book High Octane Brain, 5 Science-Based Steps to Sharpen Your Memory and Reduce Your Risk of Alzheimer's. She's passionate about empowering individuals to boost brain health and reduce the risk of Alzheimer's through the use of science-backed motivational strategies. Her mission was sparked as a teenager when she witnessed the many challenges faced by older adults with memory problems. Inspired to improve the care and quality of life for those with memory problems, she pursued a career as a neuropsychologist specializing in memory and cognition, geriatric psychiatry, motivational enhancement, and brain health. And since then, she has been honored to share her expertise with thousands of patients and their families, and on PBS, Fox TV, her Psychology Today blog, radio, and in-print media. Dr. Braun earned her undergraduate degree in cello performance and psychology from Carroll University, which is now Carroll, which was at that time Carroll College in Waukesha, Wisconsin, and a Master of Science and PhD in clinical psychology with a minor in neuroscience from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Dr. Braun completed her internship with Yale University School of Medicine and postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard Medical School, Boston VA Healthcare System. She returned to Boston as an instructor in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and assistant director of inpatient mental health at Boston VA. Dr. Braun has worked for 15 years as a clinical neuropsychologist in departments of neurology, neurosurgery, and psychiatry in hospitals and academia. She serves as the examiner for the American Board of Clinical Neuropsychology and is a previous board member of the board of directors of the American Academy of Clinical Neuropsychology, where she chaired the practice and public policy committee. She is also a previous member of the board of directors of the Wisconsin Psychological Association. Dr. Braun was honored to be selected as a 40 Under 40 award winner by the Milwaukee Business Journal in 2013, and she is also thrilled to receive the Practitioner of the Year award from the Alzheimer's Association, the Runkle Award in Psychology from Carroll University, and the Early Career Award from the Milwaukee Area Psychological Association, among others. In Michelle's spare time, she loves dancing, playing basketball and other sports, and spending time with family and friends and watching the Packers play football. So, Michelle, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing information and your knowledge about nutrition. So I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And it's great to be here with all of you this morning. I'm here in Racine. We had the opportunity to touch base a little bit with folks as they were coming in and entering the presentation to hear where others are from. So it's exciting to see that we have representation from pretty much all of the corners of Wisconsin here. La Crosse, Oconomowoc, up to Green Bay, and many others as well. So thank you for taking time today to be here with us. And it's also just an honor to be here in service of this wonderful series. And so thank you, Dr. Chin and Rebecca and Bonnie and also Jen and others who have really made this possible, and more broadly, the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Institute and also the Alzheimer's Association, of course, who have partnered so amazingly through so many different initiatives, including this. As we'll talk about in a few minutes, programs like this are really important because there really is so much out there from the marketing standpoint that really is unfortunately targeting folks who want to enhance cognitive functioning. And many of those products and services are not necessarily scientifically backed. And so this is such a wonderful series in order to really ground folks in what we know works and what we know doesn't necessarily have as much support. And importantly, to not just give you that information, hopefully today, but also pair it in a way that makes it personal for you and that really ignites your passion to act on that information. And I hope that's what you find this presentation allows you to do, is to really take the information that you learn and put it into action in small ways, and to know that we are all really doing that together as a community. I'll tell you that as I was preparing this presentation, I took a fresh look at how I have been possibly succeeding in some ways and not in other ways with regard to the way I use nutrition in my life. And taking a moment to kind of reset that is really important for all of us. So I am going to take you through a little bit of content here at the beginning, just to orient you to the process that we will be going through. And one of the things I'd like to start us off with is this thought here, that I love this quote from Shakespeare, which is, our bodies are our gardens, to which our wills are our gardeners. And I think that that really captures a lot of the sense that we were talking, that I was just mentioning, in terms of the need for us to take this information and really put it into action in a meaningful way. And so along those lines, what you will see is that I have taken what I call little X factor reflection points that I'm hoping you can all use in order to take a moment to intentionally pause during the content and have the opportunity to personalize this for yourself. And so one of the things I'd like to start out with, in honor of the upcoming Olympic Games, and really to try and drive this point home, is I'd like you to all take a moment and think of your favorite athlete. Maybe write that person's name down. And if you'd like to put that in the chat box, please do as well, because I'll be interested to see some of what you're all saying in terms of your favorite athletes. And I don't know, Jen, if you have access, if you want to read any that you're seeing. I have so many favorite athletes. I think I don't have one specific favorite, because I love athletics and I love watching athletes. But one of my favorite athletes is Michael Jordan. Of course, Aaron Rodgers too, although we're all waiting with bated breath to see what happens along those lines. And so Jen, any favorite athletes coming up? I think you're muted right now.
Thank you for helping me out there. We have Simone Biles,
Yeah.
Jordy Nelson,
Jordy
Brett Favre,
Yeah.
Tiger Woods, Serena Williams, Michael Phelps,
Yeah.
Rayford Johnson.
Okay, excellent. And why I love thinking about our favorite athletes is because chances are, if you Google the name of your favorite athlete and the word "and diet," you are likely to find that at some point they likely talked about what they eat in order to maximize their athletic performance. And as a culture, we are much more inclined to see that natural link between diet and athletic performance than we are to see the connection between diet and cognitive performance and brain health. And I think that that is partially just obvious, because from the standpoint of visually, we can see lean muscle mass, for example, a little bit more clearly. We can measure the lower resting heart rate, for example, that often results from better athletic ability. We can also see changes in oxidation, better oxygen absorption, for example. In other words, when we talk about physical performance, we're much more responsive to that idea that absolutely how you feel your body makes a difference. And when we think about the cognitive piece, I'm so happy to see that there's this increasing realization that cognitive performance really is similarly impacted in the way that physical performance is by how we fuel our body. It's just hard to see, because we've got this 3-pound amazing supercomputer that's housed in an immovable skull intentionally to protect it, but then we can't visualize the improvements that we see unless we use tools that we know work to get into that crypt, essentially, which include things like cognitive tests, neuropsychological tests, and also brain scans where we can see changes in brain volume related to nutrition. So part of what I'm hoping we talk about and you leave with is this sense that you find your X factor reflection points today that ignite you again. And I think that many of us know the things that make up a healthy diet, but it is obviously performance of those skills is something that has to touch our hearts. We have to see a relevance. And for some people, that's a health wake-up call. For some people, it's a diagnosis. For some people, it is thinking about how people that we know excel in cognitive and performance and brain health, what they're doing. So see if you can kind of go into some of those details with me as we move through this content and really personalize this for yourself. So one of the other pieces I'd like to do, just to give you a bit of a framework of where we'll be headed on this journey today, is to just give you a little visual here of some of the highlights that I'd like to touch on. So there are 5 parts that we can conceive of as really kind of our jumping off points. And I want you to kind of feel that you, for each part, are taking something, again, personal for yourself. The first is functioning, and we'll be talking about mild cognitive impairment treatment, the interaction between diet and level of cognitive functioning, and really getting specific about how does what we put in our mouths, what we ingest, really impact brain functioning. And that's where the whole title of this talk comes from, Nutrition in Action, because throughout I'd like you to flip the script that many of us have about what we eat, which is really oftentimes by habit, what we might put in our mouths, and think about being proactive and fueling your body in an intentional way to get a specific result. And that takes a little bit of a flip, but I hope the data that you see convinces you that that's possible, because it definitely is compelling data. Part 2, fueling your best self. So I tried to think of a lot of ways of connecting this idea of your ideal future self with food, and fuel, that idea of fueling your best self seemed to connect, at least for me, with this idea that, again, there's an intentional, proactive way that if you think about your best self, whether that's a month into the future, a year into the future, or more, chances are that that vision you have of yourself, which, by the way, we will take time later to have you envision, is going to be realized much more. It's much more likely that that will be realized if you take the steps to be intentional with your fueling of your body. Using mindfulness and visualization. So we're going to rely on some techniques that have actually shown to be very, very successful in helping to stoke change and make change. And all of us have barriers that have gotten in the way historically, and that maybe will continue to get in the way of us embracing some of these new habits. And part of what I wanted to do was share with you some personalized strategies, some workarounds for some of those barriers. And again, see what speaks to you. Some things may speak to you and some things may not. So we know personalized medicine, personalized approaches are so important, because again, it's not enough to know information. We need to galvanize, connect with you, and some might not. Just pay attention to what does. We're going to use this process here of the actual pieces of information and the journey of going through the content to actually maybe set you off in a slightly different direction with the lunch you have today. So let's actually think about a little change that you might make at your lunch. I will do it too. And you know, if you want to use your show of hands button, I think you might have access to that, and do a show of hands for how many of you would pledge to make any little difference to your lunch today. Please feel free to do that, or use the chat box, because there is power in this together. And we want to, as much as possible. Oh, I see somebody, Jody raised her hand. So she is on board with making a change to her lunch based on what we talk about today. All right. And I see a number of other folks with their hands raised. Awesome. See, look at, there is some power. Nate raised his hand. I see a lot of people raising their hand. That's fantastic. So we've got a lot of people on board. I'm on board too. And it really begins a lot of times to galvanize with that sense of that community energy. There is excitement here. There's empowerment. We are also going to, in light of some of the new news that came out last week from the FDA about the approval of aducanumab, which is the first Alzheimer's medication that's actually been approved since 2003. This is a historic time. And it's also the first disease-modifying medication that's been approved. We will spend a little bit of time talking about that. And I will definitely be interested in hearing about Dr. Chin's thoughts on that and other providers and people, family members, et cetera, because there are a lot of layers to think about with that announcement and moving into that frontier. And then, of course, just as always, we will end with a question and answer period. So please take note of questions that you might have and document those as we are moving through. And that will give us a jumping off point kind of at the end as well. So let's start by looking at part one, which is diet and cognitive functioning. So I'm aware you can see my screen here. So I'm assuming, Jen, if you could nod, you can see all of the people that are on my screen currently.
Yeah.
Okay, so now is that better? Are you able to see more of the screen that way?
I can see the screen.
Okay, perfect. All right, so part of what I wanted to start off with and kick off with is this idea that we have, again, several different products and services that are being advanced to the public at large, and that as healthcare providers, we are often trying to provide corrective information on that are really, again, addressing fears of cognitive decline and fears of dementia. And so as a result, there is a need for us to really just highlight some things that don't have support at this time. I'm going to add, we wish that some of these things had support. For example, we wish that we could have someone go to the drugstore and get an over-the-counter brain health supplement that actually did have support, because then that would be accessible to people and it would be something that could have widespread positive impact. But unfortunately, there is no support that brain health supplements make a difference with regard to brain health. And we will get into that in more detail later. And so this includes any number of supplements that are either directly focused on enhancing memory, or alternatively, even things like multivitamins, omega-3 supplements, fish oil supplements, things that seem like they would naturally lend themselves to better brain functioning, also do not have support beyond the nutrients that we're getting in a healthy diet. So again, we'll go into more of those details later. There's also this increased movement in the field on what I would call a personalized nutrient blend. And it often takes the form of usually requiring a number of blood tests to be done, and then any number of specific herbs, nutrients, et cetera, vitamins will be then tailored, so to speak, for a person's blood type or for their existing chemistry. And unfortunately, there is no support for those programs generally either, beyond oftentimes the researcher or clinic who is providing those tests. And that's important to note because those tend to be quite expensive. And again, these things that we're talking about, supplements, personalized nutrient blends, these are being actively looked at and examined. So certainly if we have information in the future that they do make a difference, we will be sharing that and giving that as another option. But right now, there really is no support that those are helpful. There also are what I think of as a restrictive brain health diet. Now, these often take the form of popular media, books, and programs that you might see on television. Usually that tends to be the case, where there may be a statement that, for example, all carbs are bad for the brain, or that a certain food should be outlawed for when it comes to brain health. And there really is no support that we should be cutting out whole food groups, especially healthy carbs, which actually, as you'll see, make up the foundation of some of the best brain health diets we have. So I just wanted to highlight those 3 areas, which again, we can go into more detail if you have questions on the supplement piece, we definitely will. But those are things we need to watch out for. Here is just a couple of highlights on supplements. This is a huge industry. So we see projected sales in the next couple of years approaching $6 billion. So this is, in many ways, I think, taking the medical model that we all have, many of us have great faith in, which is that if you take a medication that can help, it's the physical act of taking a pill and making a difference in the body. And so a supplement kind of fits into that mold. It seems to make sense from that basic perspective that if you take something and ingest it, it could make a difference in your body. And as we talked about, there are popular supplements for brain health: fish oil, omega-3 fatty acids, turmeric, green tea supplements. Unfortunately, that even those popular supplements don't have support. And this is a really important point to make, because if you look at some of the survey data, 73% of adults believe supplements can improve brain health. 61% actually thought they could not just improve brain health, but could actually delay dementia. And almost half of the people who were surveyed really believed that it could actually reverse dementia and go and be restorative of cognitive functioning. And so it is important to note that unless there is a nutrient deficiency, unless somebody has an actual nutrient deficiency based on usually blood testing, and specifically in vitamins B12 or B9, that there is insufficient evidence for any supplementation being helpful to brain health. And that includes, again, insufficient evidence for things even like multivitamins. So that doesn't mean that, you should go off and, change everything and overhaul everything because of this information, but definitely discuss it with your healthcare provider. For example, you might be on supplements for some other reason medically, but if you are taking supplements specifically for brain functioning, definitely this information is something to consider in the conversations you have with your healthcare provider. What do we do? What do we know works, though? So let's also talk about the flip side of the coin here of what there is good evidence for. So 3 broad categories here: exercise, and you will actually be having access to a talk coming up in September on exercise through the series, which is going to dovetail really well with what we talk about today. And specifically, I want to highlight for you that exercise is the only what we call disease-modifying intervention for mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. So as many of you probably know, the gold standard desire for any intervention is to actually modify the cellular abnormalities of the disease, not to just control symptoms. And that's actually what cardiovascular exercise does, is it actually impacts the brain cells that have been in some ways made abnormal in their functioning by improving volume, for example, of the hippocampus and minimizing shrinkage of the cortex or the outer surface of the brain. And also decreasing levels of tau, for example, which is a natural protein in the brain that starts to misperform and starts to tangle. And so, in other words, exercise actually makes a difference physically in those cellular abnormalities, which is astounding. I mean, if we had a medication that does what exercise does, I think everybody would be taking it. It's also important to note, so that's aerobic exercise or cardiovascular exercise, but also yoga and Tai Chi have been shown to be helpful in, they're not necessarily disease modifying. In other words, they're not necessarily addressing those underlying cellular abnormalities, but they do help sharpen memory functioning and help with daily functioning, possibly through better attentional control. And that's helpful to understand that they may have different mechanisms of action. We are going to be spending our time today, of course, on category number 2, which is the brain healthy diet. And I also wanted to share with you, there is some really great evidence that mindfulness, which you could conceive of as moment to moment, non-judgmental awareness, this idea, even in this moment, if you could put your hands on whatever surface is in front of you, feel what the temperature of that is, just take a moment to be in the environment you're in, listen for a moment to whatever sound is around you. Just take a moment to do that. So that really small snippet of a moment that we all just took together is kind of what mindfulness is, which is paying attention to your environment, to where you are, to what you are doing in a non-judgmental way, which can take a lot of practice. And I don't think maybe anybody ever reaches that point consistently. I think judgment is a part of our brain. And so having those moments and embracing those moments and creating space for those moments has actually been shown to improve memory functioning. And interestingly, mindfulness actually is linked with higher hippocampal volumes. In other words, there are cellular changes that occur positively due to mindfulness. So why I wanted to share this slide for you in content on nutrition, in a nutrition presentation, is because it really is the multimodal interventions that incorporate multiple interventions like this that have the greatest success in the rate of cognitive decline in mild cognitive impairment. It isn't necessarily just taking one and using it, and you'll see that based on the data. In other words, there's something synergistically going on that I don't think we fully understand yet. When we pair these interventions together, you get much more than the sum of their parts. And so again, we're focusing in depth on a brain healthy diet today, but I want you to know that the power of diet is greatly augmented when you pair it with the cardiovascular exercise. And that's really the combination that has the greatest support. I also wanted you to know about a program that is available for mild cognitive impairment out of Mayo Clinic called HABIT, which is called Healthy Action to Benefit Independence in Thinking. And again, the reason I share this with you here is just because I want to show you that in one of the main clinical programs that is rolled out in various parts of the country, that it is again multimodal. We're looking at all of the different components that have been shown to be successful and using them in combination. You'll see that in the latest research as well, that it is including multiple components. Mayo at their HABIT program uses wellness education, which does include a focus on nutrition. But let's talk first, as we set the stage here for talking about what slows down mild cognitive impairment from a dietary standpoint, by looking in a broad way at the interaction between diet and level of cognitive functioning. So I did a fresh look at the research again, just to make sure that I was picking up any new findings here. And I wanted to share a slide here with you that I think captures a lot of the information that's helpful and necessary for us to focus on with regard to different types of levels of cognitive ability and the diets that have been shown to be helpful in slowing down change in those levels. And the reason it's important, I think, for us to talk about expanding our view here beyond just what works in MCI is because some of these diets, like the Nordic diet and the Mind diet, are very new in time. So those really have been popularized more in the last 8 years or so. Whereas the Mediterranean diet, we've known since the 1950s that that's been helpful. So it's been studied a lot. We also know the DASH diet for heart health has been studied since the 90s. And so that has a lot more lead time on things like on other diets like Mind and Nordic, which my sense is may start to become more a part of the mild cognitive impairment studies. And so I want to make sure you understand a little bit about those diets too. And we will talk about how those have been shown to decrease the rate of cognitive aging in normal age-related change. And we will also talk about then and spend most of our time, of course, on mild cognitive impairment and what slows that down. You'll see that in dementia, in Alzheimer's disease or other subtypes of dementia, we don't have a lot of support for the impact of diet in slowing down the process of dementia. unfortunately, we see much more support at the levels of mild cognitive impairment and at the levels of normal age-related change with using diet to slow down cognitive change. And this makes the larger point that as a field, we have really started to back up the use of these interventions way as much as we can here. We're not waiting for, ideally, for symptoms to start. There's this recognition that if we can start to use brain healthy diets and promote those earlier in life, that these trajectories then will likely benefit. So let's start by looking at that first line, which is what has been shown to actually slow down normal age-related change. So there was a study completed in 2015 called FINGER, and that was a randomized controlled trial. And importantly, this study looked at people who had a risk of developing cognitive decline because they had the risk factors that we know can lead to that more easily. For example, they might have had vascular risk factors like high blood pressure, cholesterol issues. And so this was, again, a multimodal intervention, and it showed that people who followed for 2 years a program where they were integrating exercise, a brain healthy diet, they had some cognitive training, it was computerized training, and also modification of those vascular risk factors like the blood pressure and cholesterol modification, had an amazing 30% reduction in cognitive decline after just 2 years. That's huge. Just 2 years, you're seeing a 30% reduction. And the benefits weren't just limited to that time period. They continued for 2 more years, and actually they're still being tracked. I really want to highlight an important piece here, which is that people who had a genetic risk for Alzheimer's, in other words, APOE4, which is on chromosome 19, it's one of the genes on chromosome 19 that can increase the risk, does increase the risk of developing Alzheimer's. People who had that genetic finding actually had the same level of reduction in cognitive decline. So that's huge. That basically means that even with a genetic predisposition, these behavioral interventions made a difference. And if you're interested in more detail, I can go into it, but people who had other evidence of accelerated cellular aging had even greater benefit from this program than people who didn't. So this dispels the idea that if somebody either has a genetic predisposition or has advanced cellular aging, that they can't benefit from these healthy strategies. The Alzheimer's Association, thankfully, has now taken up a similar study in the United States. So the FINGER study was done in Norway and used a Nordic diet in Finland. And US Pointer is the Alzheimer's Association's version of that study. And that is ongoing. It's very exciting because, again, this study is intentionally looking at folks who have a higher risk of having cognitive impairment and seeing whether lifestyle modifications make a difference. And this bears really an emphasis because different populations in different parts of the world are different. And so what works in some countries may need to be modified in others, especially with regard to diet and exercise. And so US Pointer is actually using the MIND diet as their dietary intervention, which we will go through in a little bit. Let's even expand that idea though. So we've got FINGER, we've got US Pointer here in the US. Now it's very exciting to see there are similar interventions underway across the world. So look at that list of countries where we have a focus again on the culturally specific diets of those regions, which really is important because we don't want to be shipping foods, across countries, et cetera, and ignoring potentially very therapeutic foods that could be very accessible to large numbers of the population, et cetera. And so this is exciting to see that there is this awareness that healthy diets may differ by culture and do differ by culture, and trying to get as much of that information as we can to advance our knowledge of what helps slow cognitive decline. In terms of a visual that really will capture the 3 main diets we're going to be talking about today. This is a busy slide, so you don't have to remember everything here, but I do want to just point out, we're talking mainly about the DASH diet, the Mediterranean diet, and the MIND diet. And remember, based on that trajectory I showed you, that all three of these have been shown to slow cognitive decline in normal aging. In other words, they have been, people who followed these diets had lower levels of normal age-related change than people who didn't. And in fact, the MIND diet seems to have an edge in some ways with that, which we will talk about. But I want you to just note a couple of similarities amongst these diets, because otherwise it can get a little bit dizzying to try to figure out how they're the same and different. So what they have in common is fruits and vegetables and whole grains make up the foundation of all three diets. All three diets also minimize saturated fat and they minimize sugar. And so that's kind of a rubric that you can kind of use as a take-home message. You're not expected, again, to remember all of the details of all of this. But if you remember that healthy whole grains, fruits and vegetables, in particular green leafy vegetables and berries, and also minimizing red meat and saturated fats are good. If you remember those take-home messages, that can really kind of propel you in healthy ways with your brain functioning. So I wanted, though, to also highlight a couple of differences between the diets so that you could feel like you can understand how what makes them different, because I just highlighted the similarities. So Mediterranean, which we'll call MEDI, difference between the DASH diet, which is a heart health diet. DASH is a dietary approach to stop hypertension. So that was intentionally created to minimize blood pressure. And it does very well at that. That was developed in the 90s. Mediterranean diet, again, cultural diet that is followed by countries surrounding the Mediterranean. And it's important to note there is no one Mediterranean diet, that it varies by country. So people in Spain have a different Mediterranean diet than people in Italy and in France. And so we'll come back to that in terms of giving you some direction for what a model Mediterranean diet may be. But in general, the Mediterranean diet emphasizes high consumption of healthy fats like olive oil, includes wine, which is something a lot of people like to see, one glass a day, fewer servings of sweets than the DASH diet. DASH includes a recommendation for dairy foods, Mediterranean doesn't. And DASH definitely emphasizes reducing sodium intake, Mediterranean doesn't. And Mediterranean is a little bit lower in red meat consumption than DASH. If we take a look at how is the MIND diet different than those two, again, we talk about similarities. They're all plant-based. They're all low in saturated fats. But what's different? So the MIND diet was the only diet that was actually created expressly to enhance brain health. So again, Mediterranean diet just happened to be a cultural diet of the region that was never created for a health benefit. But we learned later that it had many health benefits, not just brain health, but lowering rates of cancer, lowering rates of high blood pressure. Again, the DASH diet was created for heart health, in particular hypertension. So we didn't have a diet that was proactively created just for brain health. And that's what MIND is. So MIND, imagine that the backbone of the MIND diet takes the best of DASH, the best of the Mediterranean, and then augments it with foods that have been shown to be helpful specifically for brain health. So what I like about the MIND diet is that it is, in my opinion, a bit more doable. It's a bit more practical for people. 2 or more servings of vegetables a day versus 4 in the other 2 diets. Berries twice a week versus having fruit 3 times a day in the other 2 diets. The other difference in the MIND diet is that berries are the only fruit that's recommended. In the other 2 diets, you see that there is no specific type of fruit recommended. Seafood at least once a week versus 6 times a week in the Mediterranean diet. No recommendation for dairy, which is different than DASH. And the MIND is the only one that also emphasizes specifically limiting 5 food groups that have actually been shown to be what Dr. Martha Claire Morris, who developed the MIND diet, and her team called brain deflators. So those include red meat, butter, cheese, hard to say that as a Wisconsinite, fried and fast food, and pastries and sweets. What all 5 of those foods have in common is they are high in saturated fat. And we will take a look in a few minutes at why high saturated fat can essentially compromise your neuronal functioning. So just a little bit of an overview. Again, with the MIND diet, this is a diet that reduces the risk of Alzheimer's. It reduces the risk of brain aging and includes 10 foods to emphasize and 5 to minimize. Again, we're not going to spend too much time on those details because that has not been studied yet in a consistent way in mild cognitive impairment. In terms of looking at the MIND diet, and this is just for your reference, we've got a sheet here that looks at what you're wanting to highlight in terms of the foods to maximize and minimize, and then a point system. What I really like about the MIND diet that lends itself again to real world change is that there are 3 levels of points that you can gain in the MIND diet on a weekly basis. And here you can see that the categories for having 0 points in a category, 0.5 or 1. So if you want to take a moment to write down, I'm going to give you the 3 score ranges that you can think of if you did want to share information about the MIND diet or try it yourself. Again, knowing this one has not been studied in mild cognitive impairment, but has been shown to reduce aging, brain aging. So the highest level of adherence to this is at 8.5 points or more per week. So this is a total of 15 points per week that you could get maximum. If you reach the point of having 8.5 points or more, then that is the highest level of protection and benefit that's been shown from this diet. In other words, the lowest levels. I will mention that no one really consistently got 15 points in the studies. The highest points generally, which were obtained, were about 12.5 on average. So that tertile, that top tertile. The middle range is having anywhere from 7 to 8 points. And then the lower range is 2.5 to 6.5 points. So I could go into a lot more detail about the MIND diet later if you have questions, but in the interest of talking about things that actually slow mild cognitive impairment, we'll move on. And so that's where we go next, is talking about, again, where is the evidence that Mediterranean and DASH help to slow the cognitive decline that we're hoping to slow in mild cognitive impairment. So just to clarify, mild cognitive impairment is a condition in which there is, in some cases, an increased risk that it could be progressive. It could over time develop into dementia of the Alzheimer's type, for example, or other types of dementia. It's important to know that not all mild cognitive impairment progresses. Some of it can be stable and some actually could potentially improve. But in general, when we're talking about one of the most common types of mild cognitive impairment that has been shown to progress over time, our goal, what we're trying to do, is slow that timeline down. We're trying to buy time, and that's what these diets, Mediterranean and DASH, have been shown to do. So in a 2014 meta-analysis of the Mediterranean diet, which analyzed a number of studies, it was clear that folks who followed it had a reduced risk of mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's, again, at that normal age trajectory. And importantly for our focus here today, a reduced risk of progression from mild cognitive impairment to Alzheimer's, which is fantastic that we see that finding. This is the pyramid that you can take a look at in terms of how we think about the utilization of this information. And again, knowing that the Mediterranean diet varies by country. And importantly, if we think about the Mediterranean diet, it's not outside of the Mediterranean lifestyle. In other words, it's a part of the overall lifestyle, which includes daily exercise and sharing meals with others. In other words, again, we have that multimodal component. So that's why you see kind of at the bottom level here, physical activity, being with others, as really the very basis of it. Now, one of the things that I have for you as a reference at the end of this presentation is a link to Mediterranean diet recipes and information pamphlets. And there are a lot of places that you can get this information from, but I liked basically a food think tank, a nonprofit food think tank out of Boston. And they have not only a great wealth of information, but they took their Mediterranean diet recommendations that you see here from interviewing researchers at the Harvard School of Public Health and integrating that with information from the World Health Organization. So as I said before, Mediterranean diets are all different, but this one I like because it really takes, I think, into account a lot of the best of the different Mediterranean diets. Alcohol in mild cognitive impairment is a frequent question that we run into. It's really interesting to see that one drink per day has been shown not only on that top trajectory, the normal age trajectory, to decrease the risk of cognitive impairment, but even in mild cognitive impairment, that having one drink per day has been shown to reduce the rate of progression to dementia. And it really depends on the research you look at as to what type of alcohol. Some research does not show a difference between alcohol type. In other words, beer, wine, or liquor don't seem to have a difference. It's just that one drink per day. But some research also does show that wine perhaps might have a slower progression, people who drink wine. Interestingly, some of the research on mild cognitive impairment does not show a difference in terms of cognitive progression between people who abstain from drinking and have nothing and those who have more than one drink a day. So there is something about having that one drink per day that is therapeutic. And the latest thinking on that is it likely helps with cardiovascular health, and then having better cardiovascular health may help with brain health. One of the things I want to emphasize, though, is the serving sizes are perhaps a little smaller than we might often think of depending on how you measure a drink. So when we talk about one drink per day, we really have to first focus on the level of alcohol content, because the level of alcohol content determines the ounces. So if you have, for example, let's go down to the beer category, 5% alcohol beer is 12 ounces. Many beers today have much more than 5% alcohol. So if that's the case, you need to adjust the ounces. And there are some online calculators that allow you to do that. But on average, the average beer, if it has 5% alcohol, will be 12 ounces. The average wine with 12% alcohol content would be 5 ounces. And liquor, if it was 80 proof and had 40% alcohol, would be about 1.5 ounces, which is a very small amount. So it's important to note that anything above those amounts was shown to be more toxic for the brain. And so it really does seem to be that smaller amount that is helpful in decreasing the rate of cognitive decline. Next question often people ask is, well, why is the Mediterranean diet therapeutic in MCI? What's going on at a cellular level that's allowing that to happen? And this is, again, setting the stage for this idea that nutrition in action. Nutrition is having a physical impact on your cellular functioning. So number one, it reduces inflammation in the body and oxidative stress. We're going to go into what that is. Basically, it's advanced aging of the cells. With through a couple of different mechanisms that involve immune changes, positive immune changes, and protection of the cells. The second is cardioprotective. So we're most familiar with the cardioprotective element because we oftentimes are aware of the information about Mediterranean diet being helpful for vascular health. We know that it helps with blood pressure and cholesterol, and it reduces coronary artery disease. And it helps with diabetes, and it helps people have a healthier weight. What I'm going to spend more time on, because it's not quite as known in the world of the Mediterranean diet, is this piece, which is what is happening in the brain when we eat foods that are part of the Mediterranean diet. So before we go there, let's just also talk about an interesting study that was done on the DASH diet. So again, Mediterranean and DASH have been shown to slow cognitive decline in mild cognitive impairment. And this is one of the really interesting studies just done a couple of years ago, looked at 160 older adults with mild cognitive impairment and one or more cardiovascular risk factors. So again, folks who had an increased risk of having more cognitive decline. And they were divided into 4 groups. The first was doing exercise only, aerobic exercise only. The second was just doing the DASH diet. The third was doing both aerobic exercise and the DASH diet. And the fourth was getting weekly heart health education. So group 1 did show a small improvement in what we call executive functioning skills on cognitive tests. In other words, they showed a little boost in their ability to plan and to organize when it came to problems they were given. However, as we started off with, it was really those synergistic effects that were happening in group 3, where aerobic exercise was going hand in hand, dovetailing in some really interesting ways with diet to show the largest improvement on those cognitive tests. And compared to folks who didn't do those interventions, they had a 10-year reversal of some of the changes they previously had in their brain aging. Now, that's pretty amazing if you think about it, but again, drives home the point that we want to always be including diet within the context of exercise if possible. So we'll take a little breather here. And I know this is a lot of information, and I'm going to actually just expand this list of folks a little bit so I can see you a little. And we will have time, of course, for questions, but I'd like you to just take a moment here and pause. And along the lines of the X factor reflections that we're talking about to personalize this information for you, I'd just like you to take a few, maybe about a minute or so, to just write down something that you learned in this first part that you feel really connected with you. Maybe it was an aha moment. Maybe it was seeing some of the data on the impact of what works versus what doesn't work. Something that really spoke to you. So just take a moment to do that. Again, the goal here is to really make this something that you feel connects with your priorities and with what you feel speaks to you. And think different things, of course, speak to all of us differently. So now let's move into what I think is a really crucial part of making these changes. I have personally benefited a lot from thinking about how does what I put in my mouth actually impact the brain cells, my brain cells. Because if you think about the idea, again, from a proactive standpoint, that you're intentionally depositing nutrients in your body to do a job for you, it really shifts things. So let's take a look at our brains first from the standpoint of density of the tissue. And so many of us are familiar with this schematic of looking at, on your left, the fuller, healthier, denser brain tissue, and on the right, tissue that has had accelerated aging, perhaps due to Alzheimer's. This area on the left is a section where you can see the hippocampus in both hemispheres highlighted. Now, the hippocampus, I'd like you to imagine if you curled your thumb in front of you, and it's a little curled thumb-shaped structure. It's about 1.5 inches in, as you can see, behind each ear into the center of your head. And it really does serve as the switchboard for new information that you're processing. So when you're learning this information, for example, your hippocampus is working overtime. If we had a metabolic brain scan right now, like a PET scan to look at how much your brain was taking in glucose, those hippocampal areas probably would be lit up right now in terms of how much they're processing or trying to process, because they're doing a lot of work with this information. And so it's really those areas that we're trying to target when we think about exercise and diet, and trying as much as we can to enhance the cellular makeup of those areas. Now, exercise shows much more of a direct ability to increase the density of the hippocampus. But diet, increasingly, we understand, may have more of a broad effect in impacting brain functioning at the cellular level across cells. So let's take a look at, well, what happens? Okay, so here we are at lunch today, about 1.5 hours away from that, hour away from the end of this presentation. So many of us raised our hand at the beginning to say, we will make a change, maybe a little tweak to our lunch today. So imagine, here you are, putting something in your mouth at lunch today. And what is happening is the question after you put that in your mouth. What's happening after that point? That's kind of invisible to us, but let's unpack that a little bit. So of course your saliva starts getting to work right away to break down the food right in your mouth. And then as the food goes into your stomach, the stomach acid then starts to further break down the food, and those nutrients start to get absorbed into the walls of your small intestine. Now, interestingly, things like alcohol often can be directly absorbed from the stomach right into the bloodstream, which is sometimes why it has such a quick effect on your ability to think, for example. But if you're thinking about food in general, substances are then broken down by the blood, transported by the blood to the liver where they're broken down, and then transported around the body to the brain, including to the brain. So one of my favorite ways of capturing the amazing network that takes and makes this happen and takes these nutrients and ferries them around. Many of us are used to thinking of the blood structure, the vascular structure of the brain in a very broad way. You know, we've got the major arteries, et cetera. But I really like highlighting the capillary beds, because that really brings to bear this idea that there are thousands and millions of little tiny capillaries that are responsible for nourishing the tissue. And if we think about the fact that those nutrients then are getting ferried to all of those little tiny capillaries, then we move to the level of the cells. And so when those neurons absorb and are given access to those nutrients, what do? They're actually doing something with that then. They're actually producing new neurotransmitters in the brain. And one of the good examples of this is soybeans that has a nutrient called choline in it, which is the building block for acetylcholine, which is a memory neurotransmitter. So those cells are getting to work with whatever you put into your mouth to do a job. They are also creating new fats and proteins. So for example, neurons are encased in something called the myelin sheath, which is a fatty substance that helps with transmission. It helps to speed transmission. And some of the neurons are then creating new myelin. They're creating new cellular protection. And they're also helping chemical reactions occur. So there's a real clear sort of strategy with how your body is taking in what you use. And then there's a very clear path with what is happening to the nutrients. So what are we trying to increase? What are we trying to avoid? What are we trying to decrease? And this goes back to the dietary strategies. So remember how we talked about the idea that all three of the diets, the main diets we're talking about, have low levels of saturated fat? Well, the reason for that is partially because high saturated fat has unstable atoms in it. So if we think about what is an unstable atom, it's called a free radical. In other words, if you looked at the cells within the saturated fat, see that they're made up of what we call free radicals that have unstable electrons. I'm going to show you a visualization of this. What do they do? Why is that a problem to be taking in free radicals in your body? Well, they accelerate aging across the body, not just in the brain, but blood vessels, skin, etc. But they also can damage cells and how they actually function. So fried foods are a big source of free radicals, as is alcohol. Of course, there are environmental sources as well: tobacco, smoke, air pollutants, pesticides. And that's part of the reason that we try to minimize exposure there. But if we think about the commonalities that all of those have, they really do have in common high levels of free radicals. And so I wanted to show you what happens to the cells when you have high levels of free radicals that you may be ingesting in your body. So here you've got your normal cells, sitting around making acetylcholine, connecting with each other, neurons that fire together and wire together. They're having, they're allowing you to think of things that you enjoy, to enjoy music, etc. And then here comes some free radicals from whatever source. And they start, because they're unstable at a cellular level, they want to complete the outer orbit of their electron shell. And so let me show you what I mean by that. Here's your free radical. It's unstable because it has an unpaired electron in it. And it is looking here at your cells in your brain, your neurons that are sitting around, they're stable, they're doing a good job. And it wants to rob one of those electrons from your good cells so that it can complete its own outer ring here. And that is what is happening when we think about oxidation. Is oxidative stress is the free radicals are attacking the healthy cells and they are creating accelerated aging with the cells. And so what can we do instead? Two things, either ingest fewer free radicals and or ingest more antioxidants, because antioxidants you can think of as a decoy. They will give up their electron. You want them to give up their electron to the free radical versus having the free radical take it from your stable cell. And that's what they do. That's how antioxidants are therapeutic, is they help to minimize oxidative stress by decreasing the bad influence of free radicals. We're going to take that further and think about that in the visualization, because if you imagine there's a little bit of a war going on in a sense, you're taking in things that hopefully are therapeutic and protecting these molecules. You want to protect them, but unwittingly, we may be taking in things that are kind of attacking them. And you want to send in the forces here with those antioxidants in order to help out. So what can you send in is the question. You can send in foods that are rich in vitamins A, C, and E. They're going to, again, serve as the decoy for free radicals. And again, we're all taking in free radicals all the time from a variety of sources. So even if you do have a diet that's lower in saturated fat, you still want to have antioxidant rich foods because they may help to take give that outer electron to free radicals that developed from pollution or from smoke that you were exposed to, et cetera. So these are some of the leading foods that are rich in antioxidants. And I have just some other information here about how specific antioxidants like vitamin E. What is vitamin E doing? It's doing a number of things, protecting the cellular membrane. It's again protecting against the oxidative injury we just talked about. I was so interested to see that it also decreases beta amyloid deposition. Beta amyloid is one of the proteins that goes awry in Alzheimer's and starts to clump together. But vitamin E actually decreases the deposition of that. And it also decreases neuronal loss. So this is the reason why the healthy foods that are recommended is because they are having that cellular impact. I chose two types of nutrients to highlight for you today intentionally because I feel that the research suggests that they are the most powerful. So one is the antioxidants and two is the omega-3 fatty acids. There are many, many other nutrients that have positive action on the brain, but these two stand out due to the amount of research data that we have suggesting they make a strong difference. So omega-3 fatty acids are another way that you have of protecting your brain and enhancing the cellular structure. So they strengthen cell membranes, they strengthen the blood-brain barrier itself, and they help the neurons talk to each other. They decrease inflammation. And as many of you know, they're often found in fatty fish, things like salmon, mackerel, sea bass, sardines, and in vegetable sources as well, flax, walnuts, chia seeds, edamame, kidney beans. But as we think about personalizing this, I want you to think about how you can take the visualization that you have here and think about it while you're eating, because that will make a difference. I included just some other brain healthy nutrients. As I mentioned, there are many. Anthocyanin, which is an antioxidant found in red, purple, and blue fruits and vegetables, folate, vitamin C. But again, a big part of this presentation is how do you take this and actually put it into action? I don't want to flood you with too much information. This is just for your reference. But if we want to really put this into action, let's join together in picturing the impact of having antioxidants in terms of protecting our cells and essentially taking care of nullifying the free radicals, and also look at the omega-3 fatty acids. Starting there, and then we can move to the other areas later, but I think those are the two that really beckon us to start. So let's take another moment again before we talk more about how to make this personal for you. And I'd like you to just take a pause point here, another X factor reflection, and think about something that you might have learned in this last few minutes in the section on how does nutrition actually impact your brain. Just take a moment and jot down something that spoke to you, something that you feel uniquely motivates you, maybe something you didn't know that you think could really be helpful for you in making this a part of your life. So I see a number of you writing, looking at some of the screenshots here. Excellent. All right. So let's move into the next section here, which is fueling your best self. We've all got a number of pieces of information now that you are using, thinking about from your X factor reflections, and let's go further into that. So this is where we're really going to get a lot more detail on what speaks to you personally. I think of this as more of a personalized approach to making dietary changes stick. So that idea of having something really become a part of life for you. So let's take a moment here, about a minute or so. I want you to just feel free to close your eyes. If you want to turn off your screen while you do this, that's fine. And I will talk to you. I want you to take a moment to think about yourself next year. So here we're going to 2022, next spring. So embarking on the beginning of the summer. And I want you to imagine yourself at your healthiest point. So just take a moment to think of that. Just imagine what you would look like. Imagine how you would feel. Imagine maybe what you would be doing. Maybe a favorite activity, something that really gives you joy. Maybe you're with people that you love, or maybe you're not. Maybe you're by yourself reflecting or taking some time in nature. Whatever it is that makes you feel uniquely touched and satisfied and joyful. And look at yourself there. Look at how you look at how you feel. And now take a moment to come back here. And I have a couple of images here that might speak to you, or not. Images of people together here, enjoying sports, an image of someone kind of thinking about their potential, what they could, reflecting on maybe what they will do, what they have done, an image of somebody who's imagining how they could meet a huge goal in the future. So the point of this exercise is that whatever you visualized, you are much more likely to realize that if you start to imagine that you're using nutrition to fuel your best self. And the reason I think I can say that to you is because the data is very clear that fueling yourself in an intentional way enhances your cognitive functioning, it decreases brain aging, and it enhances quality of life. And so you're essentially making gains toward that vision with some of the dietary changes we're talking about today. So one of those that I think Bonnie mentioned had been done in the past as well is something called a mindful eating exercise. And so there is a wonderful researcher and clinician named Dr. Jon Kabat-Zinn, who created a mindfulness meditation for stress reduction course. And a big part of his focus is mindfulness, integrating mindfulness into all of the things that we all do. So if you have a food in front of you, you don't have to have a food in front of you. You can do this at lunch if you want to as well. But if you have a food in front of you, you can take a moment to look at it, which is part of being mindful, is really taking time to visually examine and to be observant of what's happening in the moment, taking time to look at the food, taking time to determine the texture on your lips and in your mouth, and thinking of, as well as you're eating it slowly and intentionally to try and get a sense of what is the texture, how does it change, etc. So it's essentially taking time to really be mindful and observant of how that experience of eating is. I think that based on what we've talked about today, you could even boost this. You could kind of add a boost to that exercise with taking in one of the visualizations we talked about. So here's a quick way of thinking of what you can visualize the next time you're eating an antioxidant rich food. So maybe the next time you're having green leafy vegetables, for example, you might think, okay, this is what I'm doing. I'm putting these antioxidants in, so these free radicals take that electron instead of the electron from my hippocampus, for example, instead of destabilizing that. The next time you're eating salmon or flax, walnuts, for example, you might think of this visualization, which is strengthening of the cellular membrane. So maybe just play around a little bit with that after today's presentation about how you can merge the mindfulness with a boost of the nutrition in action. There's a really interesting study that was just done that I think can give us a lot of direction as well about other ways that we can be successful on the journey of decreasing cognitive aging. And this is a study that looked at brain health coaching. And it looked at somebody called a brain health champion that was used in a study of 40 individuals who had either mild cognitive impairment, mild dementia, or subjective cognitive impairment. In other words, they were concerned about their thinking skills. And over 6 months, this brain health coach was involved with some of the folks and not with others. The coach talked to the individual weekly through motivational interviewing phone calls. You know, a lot of what we're doing today is motivational interviewing techniques where we think about how to not just take information in a generic way, but how to personalize it and how to galvanize yourself. So that those phone calls were happening weekly for these folks. They were getting 3 visits with the brain health champion. The brain health champion was really getting down to these X factors for each person. And they were developing short goals, medium goals, and then long range goals. The short goals were for about a week, the medium were about 6 weeks, and the long range were about 6 months. They were providing support and education throughout. So what happened after those 6 months? Well, the folks who had that brain health champion had increased physical activity, they increased their adherence to the Mediterranean diet, they had increased cognitive and social activity and better quality of life. So the conclusion here is that we can pair visualization, mindfulness techniques. We can enhance our success perhaps by having a brain health champion, somebody who maybe we are either working with professionally or in our personal lives, who is providing support and coaching us. And we know if we practice in clinical settings, this might be something that we try as well, because the whole point of the study was to show that individuals who may be having cognitive changes can make these lifestyle changes and can do them successfully with having a champion on board. So let's pause here for a moment. And I'd like to invite you to just think back to what we've talked about with the visualization, the mindfulness, and also the idea of a brain health champion. And I'd like you to write down whether or not you feel that boosting mindfulness exercise with a visualization of nutrition in action, do you think that would be helpful to you? So just kind of think through that. You can write down whether you think that would be helpful. And then I'd also like you to think about whether or not you feel it would be helpful to have a brain health champion. And this is something we all can use. Again, the idea is all of us are aging cognitively. And so I think, are joined in the idea of wanting to slow that down. And so who can we enlist as a partner on that journey who we may be able to connect with consistently that can be our champion and that we can maybe champion as well. So just take a moment to write that down onto your X factor reflection list. I'm watching some of you writing things down and all right. So now this is a different thing I want you to write down. I want you to think about in the past, what has potentially gotten in the way for you from making changes with regard to eating healthier? Take a moment and write down whatever that is. Lunch change, whatever that will be. What is it that's gotten in the way? For me, it's been time. I feel like I don't have enough time to put these strategies into action consistently. And I'm also not a natural cook. I admit that. And so I feel like I would need a lot of guidance with recipes. So those are things that I've identified as my hurdles. And whatever hurdles you've identified, I'm hoping that some of the things we'll talk about next will speak to some strategies around those, some workarounds. So how about the hurdle? It doesn't really matter what I eat. My brain is kind of aging the way it will, and it doesn't really matter. So what are some ways that, these aren't necessarily just hurdles you personally might be experiencing. They may be hurdles that a loved one or someone you're working with might say to you. And so if you heard that, or if you experienced that, it can be helpful to highlight that there is really strong research that healthy diet slows the progression of mild cognitive impairment. And it can actually be made more personal if you invite someone or you yourself, just record how you feel after you eat healthy food versus unhealthy food. And when I say how you feel, being specific can be helpful. How did you sleep? How was your mood? So part of what I shared with you at the beginning about thinking about your favorite athlete and how they fuel their body intentionally, they oftentimes will say they not only fuel their body intentionally for better athletic performance, but they fuel their body intentionally because they want to manipulate how they feel. So Michael Jordan was an example of that. He noticed a strong connection between what he ate and his mood and how he felt on the court emotionally. And so thinking about how you feel when you eat foods and connecting that can actually be very helpful. I think it's also very helpful if we broaden our focus beyond brain health to think about what are the bonus benefits of a healthy diet. So we've talked a little bit about some of those bonus benefits. So Mediterranean diet, for example, it is connected with lower risk of cardiac events. It's connected with having a healthier weight. It's connected with decreased cellular aging, which is essentially healthier skin, improved muscle tone and mobility. In other words, that if we think about the variety of ways that our body can benefit, our mind can benefit, suddenly that statement, it doesn't really matter what I eat, becomes transformed. I don't have enough time to eat healthy. So here are some strategies that can help with that. One is batch cooking, maybe 1 or 2 times a week, where you're intentionally making larger amounts of food in order to have them set aside for future meals. That can be really helpful for busy folks. It can be very helpful if you feel like you are wanting to just have something on the go. So there's a lot of, you don't have to just make batch meals, you can make batch snacks. So you can make batch granola balls or batch fruit granola, for example. So there's a lot of ways that you can put together food proactively so that in the moment when you're really busy, you can just grab it and go. A nutrient bullet, that's something I actually use quite a bit. And you can figure out a different name for that name bullet if you don't like that. I just kind of came up with that, but that is, if you're really busy and you don't have time, for example, dark green leafy vegetables are good for you. You could, if you want, I do this almost every night, take spinach or whatever that dark green leafy vegetable is, I put it together into a little pile and I just eat it. It takes about 30 seconds, but I've got my serving of dark green leafy vegetables for the day. Sometimes it's in a smoothie as well, or I'll do both. I'll do a smoothie in the morning and then that nutrient bullet at night. Because I feel like I unfortunately might not have time to make a salad. But so that's one way if you're trying to really kind of get that in quick. I also do that with blueberries at night. And you could also pack food ahead of time. So packing food ahead of time is helpful. I also am fascinated by the concept of go-to foods. So if you think about many of us, what we eat, a lot of times we're eating similar foods, or you have, a few meals that you might repeat. And so having those shifted in a way so that they have healthier ingredients can give you that foundation that you can kind of go to and feel like you have maximized, which is great. Checking out simple online recipes is really helpful. And again, you'll have that resource at the end for the recipes, but that also helps with the hurdle, I don't know what to make. So here's another hurdle. I don't like how healthy food tastes. Sometimes you hear that too, especially if you haven't had a lot of good recipes with healthy food, or the healthy food you've had has been in a form that really hasn't tasted good. And that's really easy to do, to feel like you're not getting that as much. So what can you do? You can add healthy substitutes to favorite recipes. So for example, if you like spaghetti with meatballs, you could think about substituting a red meat meatball with a turkey meatball, or a quinoa meatball. You could think about substituting the spaghetti, which may be a white flour base, with a bean noodle, with quinoa noodles. So there's all kinds of creative noodles out there that are actually really healthy. And you can maybe start with substituting just one of those things and seeing how you feel it tastes. And in fact, if you look at some of the research, that's where most people seem to get the greatest benefit, is if they start with a recipe they really like and then just add a healthy substitute for a component. You can also add a healthy food to a recipe you already like. So instead of substituting, you can add in. So maybe, for example, if you don't want to change the components of your spaghetti that you start with, you don't want to substitute, you could add in a spinach salad, or you could add in peppers, for example. It can also be helpful to adjust our expectations and to know that it does take time for taste buds to adjust. And so if you think to yourself, okay, well, I'm going to try this, I'm going to give myself at least 6 times to try this. And it's interesting to see that the taste buds do start to evolve, and they do start to normalize to the new tastes. And then sometimes if you go back to what you were eating before, it just doesn't taste as good, which is fascinating how that works. You can also change the appearance of food. So sometimes people have an aversion to healthy food because of, again, oftentimes an early experience with it where it wasn't cooked well or presented well. And so if they see the sprig of broccoli, or they see something that looks like a Brussels sprout, they'll just immediately recoil. And so chopping it up and putting it into a salad or an omelet so that it has a different appearance can actually make a world of difference. We may have, you might chuckle to yourself if you remember back to any experience you've had where, somebody might say, wow, what's in that recipe? And maybe there was something in it that they thought they didn't like, but it was disguised in a way that they didn't realize what it was. So changing the appearance of food is actually a really powerful way of sneaking in healthy options. So let's take a moment here to reflect on some next steps and think about what you might use as strategies to overcome some of the hurdles that you wrote down. And I want you to just take a moment and write down maybe 1 or 2 things that you learned that could be workarounds for the hurdles that we talked about. So you're putting this again on your X factor reflection sheet. Again, thinking back to something that spoke to you about a workaround for a hurdle or hurdles you've had. I want to share with you a quote that I feel is really helpful in thinking about change, which is the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is today, because that really is true. Now let's go back to the lunch you're having today. Just take a moment to write down something that you might try to do. That may be a tweak to something that, maybe a tweak you will make based on what you heard about today. So I'm actually headed out for lunch after this. So that's always a little bit of a challenge when you go out to a restaurant. So my tweak that I'm going to make and actually, so I have to do it now that I'm going to say it, is I will minimize the amount of dessert that I was going to have, maybe have half as much. So it's important that we don't deprive ourselves. And I will increase the vegetable serving that I was going to have anyway. If any of you want to write in the chat box what tweak you might make to your lunch today, please feel free. And Jen, if you want to share those, if you see any, please feel free as well. It doesn't have to be big. It can be really small. Knowing that we're doing it together. Jen, do you see anything?
Oh, let's see. Somebody says they're going to add a piece of fruit.
Awesome.
Have a green vegetable.
Those are super powerful.
Mm.
In the Mind Diet research, it was interesting to see that the dark green leafy vegetables in particular had the strongest ability to decrease brain aging. So people who had one serving a day, just one serving a day over 10 years had an 11-year slowing of their cognitive aging. So it's pretty powerful.
Oh, now they're really coming in.
Okay, what's coming in?
We've got Carol is going to eat lettuce with her lunch.
Awesome.
Susan is going to eat more spinach and broccoli.
Yay.
Bonnie's going to have a leafy green salad instead of a pasta salad.
Ooh, that's awesome.
Kathy is going to eat dark chocolate and blueberries. And
Yay.
she just can't wait. She says, yum. William is going to add spinach to his omelet.
Awesome.
Nate is going to start dinner with spinach or kale.
Yay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm loving those, especially the antioxidant rich foods we're hearing about here too.
I am just happy that my parents who live next door to me are berry farmers. They grow all sorts of raspberries and blackberries and blueberries, and so right in my backyard.
Oh my gosh. And what I love about the berry research is it is not, especially with the Mind Diet, it wasn't specific to berry type. You know, we know blueberries have been shown to be helpful in many studies, but Mind didn't find any distinction between the health of strawberries, blueberries, blackberries, etc. So that's awesome to have variety too.
And then Bridget said, I am going to have water rather than another type of beverage.
Awesome. Awesome. And while we're moving ahead to the next section, I would love to get your feedback, and you can just say yes or no to this question as to whether you feel like imagining, visualizing the nutrition in action at the cellular level is a helpful strategy to you. Does that make you want to fuel your body differently if you imagine what's happening? So just in the chat box, yes or no. And Jen, if you can share what you're seeing.
We have overwhelming yeses.
Awesome.
Yes, 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 yes.
I know for me, that makes such a difference to think about that.
I love your visualizations with the free radicals and the antioxidants coming in and
yeah,
providing for them what they needed instead of taking away from good stuff.
Yes.
Very
I think that just is such an empowering thing to realize that you're arming your body essentially, and you're protecting your cells. It's so, it just flips it all on its head. It takes something that we do reflexively and gives us power to change that. So I'm happy to hear that that was helpful. We're going to go into a totally different direction here in the interest of talking a bit about, again, the revelation that has occurred in the field here in the last week. And I invite Dr. Chin as well to join me if you'd like, to talk about aducanumab, which again is the first FDA approved medication for the treatment of Alzheimer's since 2003. And it, as I mentioned, is the first disease modifying medication. And again, by disease modifying, what's important to emphasize is that the previous medications and the existing medications that are sometimes prescribed are designed to try to slow down the process of cognitive decline, but they don't, in other words, manage symptoms, but they don't impact the underlying cellular abnormalities. They don't change the beta amyloid deposition. They don't change tau, which are the main cellular abnormalities. On the flip side, aducanumab does consistently show, if you look at the data that across 2 clinical trials that they ran, that it does significantly reduce beta amyloid. The challenge historically with aducanumab has been that many drugs in the past have shown that they can decrease beta amyloid at a cellular level, but the hurdle that all of them have faced is to say whether that actually makes a clinical difference. In other words, does it actually slow cognitive decline and functional decline? And so the concerns with aducanumab are, that there just isn't consistent evidence that it does do those things. It also does pose a challenge when we think about the cost, which is about $56,000 a year just for the drug that does not include the infusion. So it actually has to be infused into the body. And there is some risk of cerebral hemorrhage and swelling, and that risk doubles if somebody has any kind of a genetic risk for Alzheimer's. It's also a concern that it was approved, if you look at the package insert, to treat Alzheimer's of any severity. And in the studies that were done, in only one of the 2 studies, it showed that there were some mild positive changes that occurred, but only in patients who had very mild symptoms at a very high dose of the drug. So we'll talk about next steps as well, but Dr. Chin, I just wanted to invite you as well to share your thoughts, because this is something our community has been waiting for, is more medication. And so we want to embrace it and be very excited about it, but we also want to think about it in a balanced way.
I think, first of all, I think your slide is really helpful here. So first of all, thank you for showing that, Michelle.
Sure.
And I would agree, there's a lot of debate and a lot of mixed feelings about it, but it doesn't take away the significance of this approval. And it
Yes.
is approved. And I mean, so one way or the other, the FDA weighed the evidence and they listened to experts and they said, well, this matters right now, and that we need something. And while this drug is it's not a cure and it doesn't stop the progression, at least the evidence they're able to show is that there is slowing over the 18-month period. For me, I also think it's significant because it changes the way the field is going to be moving. There are going to be more drugs that come out. It's never usually the first drug that's the big one. It's the number 2 or number 3 that comes afterwards. Some drug has to pave the way and go through all these hurdles. And that happens to be aducanumab. But I can tell you, we already have clinical trials underway with other drugs that work similarly, that remove that protein from the brain. And so this approval has sort of set the stage for these other drugs to now be more heavily investigated, but to also consider the other causes. So this drug removes amyloid, but we're still trying to explore and understand, well, what is it that generates more amyloid? And so it isn't that we're turning a blind eye to those other causes like inflammation and oxidation and these other things. It's just that now we have a framework, both in a clinical world and now in a research world, to do this. And so one of the things that I just always caution people is we still have to wait for CMS and Medicare to determine if they'll approve the payment of this. And they have the authority to also determine which individuals will be eligible. The studies were done in individuals with mild cognitive impairment and mild stage dementia, but the FDA approved it for anyone who has, quote, Alzheimer's disease. And so there's a lot of things that need to go into that. How do you identify this Alzheimer's disease protein? Which category of individuals is most likely to receive the greatest benefit? And then of course, process. How does the hospital or healthcare system implement it? But I can promise you, every hospital institution is already looking at could this be done? And so there's a lot of things happening behind the scenes, but certainly whether a provider agrees or disagrees with the FDA decision, it's still an exciting time, and it is a pivotal time in Alzheimer's disease care.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with that more. It's sort of an inflection point, I think, for our discipline and for this from the standpoint of developing hope and knowing, as you said to Dr. Chin, that this is a process that now is galvanized to move in a different direction as well. And so it is an exciting time. And one of the pieces as well that, I love about your statement as well is that, this is something that is kind of game changing when we think about future medications too. And the fact that medication development is an iterative process. It does take a lot of trial and error, and it's a historic undertaking. So it's exciting from that standpoint for sure.
Something that I like to tell my patients, because in clinic, and I'm sure Dr. Braun's experiencing the same thing, people are asking about this. What does this mean? What does this mean? Well, the same way that Dr. Braun showed that great pyramid where we talked about the diet, right? But what is truly the foundation of that diet? Well, it is sort of these lifestyle behaviors, which we would all argue, right, how to be well, how to address our holistic health. And that doesn't change with this drug. In fact, hopefully it means that people who are in the best shape physically, mentally, socially are going to do better when these treatments come out. And so for me, it doesn't change the emphasis of my discussions with patients in the community, because I still think these are the foundational tenets. The information that Dr. Braun's talking about, this diet. I don't know if you can see it. Oh, no, I don't have it in the background anymore. I bought, I don't know if I should really be advertising this, but I bought multiple copies of this so that I could give this to my clinical team, because this is really the foundation of wellness, of slowing aging changes, or really being in your best performance. That does not change with a drug, right? So we can do a lot for diabetes and high blood pressure, and those medications are still needed, but it doesn't change that the foods that we eat, the sleep that we get, the exercise that we engage in, the people that we care about, those are still going to be the cornerstone. And the same is true for aducanumab or the next drug that comes down the line. And I would argue there are going to be studies looking at people who receive the other drugs and these other lifestyle interventions and seeing if there's going to be a change. And I would suspect there's going to be more benefit for people who are conscientious about living the best life they can.
Yeah, I think that's so beautifully said, because there is this magic to synergy that we continue to see across studies, where when we're integrating multiple components, and like you said, Dr. Chin, if we can look at the medications in the context of that and see potentially maybe more of a synergistic effect, that would be so exciting. So I also wanted to just share some of my contact information if you have questions beyond today.